Hello, my name is Andrew. This is my feature explanation video. And for this video, we will be looking at the game 2048. So this is a game which features tiles with numbers on them, which move around the screen based on the user input and can combine together to form ever larger tiles. And the goal of the game is to get to the number 2048. So for this feature presentation, we're going to be looking at how these tiles are generated and a little bit in how they move around the screen. So before we jump into the code, I'm going to give a high overview of how the app is structured. So it's composed of four main parts: a tile view, game board view, view controller, and game model. The tile view and the game board view are going to be sort of the thing that the user sees, the place where we have the animation of the game itself. And then the game, we also will have a game model, which is going to be an object or class that contains the state and rules of the game, tracks sort of what is happening, and figures out what needs to happen next. The view controller will sit between these two. It will take in the user inputs. It will then pass that information to the game model. The game model will tell it what needs to happen and what needs to be changed, and this information will be passed then to the game board view and the tile view, which will animate for the user. So we'll start by looking at the view controller that controls a game and initiates the process of creating the tile. So on viewDid, when we look at the viewDid load function, we see that we call the setup game here. And this method is going to initialize our game board, initialize our game, and kind of start the whole proceeding. So the majority of this is devoted to setting up the scoring, setting up the positions for the game board. But if we go all the way to the bottom, we see this function here, insert tile at random location. And this is what's really going to start the process. So one thing that's interesting to notice here is that this function is not executed here within the view controller, but actually within the model. So this model is the game model, which is part of the initialization of this view, and is actually where we're going to create the view itself. So the game board model is where we're going to store the state of the game and figure out what needs to get done. A lot of this information is going to get stored in the game board object. This object is a collection of tile objects. And between these two, we'll be able to know where all the tiles are on the board, what their values are, and where they're moving to. And we're going to need to add some tiles to it. So that'll happen down here with these three functions. First, we have insert tile at random location, which we called earlier from the view controller. This is first going to look for open spots on the game board. This is done by this function right here, game board empty spots. It's essentially going to just use two for loops to iterate through all the different locations that could be in the game board list that we just looked at. And it's going to check to see if they're empty. And if they are empty, it will append it to this buffer list, which will then get sent back to our function here. Assuming, we'll check to make sure real quick that it's not empty, in which case no more spots can be added, and we don't need to worry about this. And then we're going to pick a random location by picking a random integer from the range of the length of our potential location list, and then we're going to pick one. We will then use this insert tile function to actually create the new tile. So that's going to happen up here with this function. First, we'll use the location that's past this function, pick a set of coordinates. We'll make sure that it's empty, and then we will append a tile object to the game board object within this game model to let us ourselves know that the state of the game now has a model there. Next, we're going to delegate inserting a tile back to the view controller at this location. So at this point, we've now updated the game model. We figured out where we want to put the tile. We've stored that location and updated the state of the game. And now it's time to actually show this to the user. So as we go back to the view controller, if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we'll see that insert tile function that we called in the game model. This function is just here to pass, essentially just here to pass information from the game model to the game board view. It's pretty much going to confirm that we have a board view, and then it's going to call this insert tile function in the game board. This is the view that controls the overall game board. And this is where a lot of the visual stuff is going to happen. So if we come down here to insert tile, this is the function that's actually created. So first we check to make sure the position is valid. And this is just a function that's going to make sure that the coordinates are actually on the game board. We're not really checking for collisions here. Then we use the standard tile width padding variables to set up what the size and position of the tile is going to be, as well as its radius. And then here we instantiate the tile view as this object here, given all of these parameters. So we'll take a quick look at the tile view that we're creating here. This view is just going to be essentially a small block that we're going to initialize given the information that's passed by the game board view. The main properties it's going to have are the label and the text and the background color. And that label will actually be a subview that we add to this view. But overall, it's pretty much just going to create a simple block. Coming back to the game board view, we now have the tile view object, and we're going to add this set affine transform. So this is the first animation that we're going to add. So an affine transform is kind of a way of thinking about it, is making something bigger while locking the aspect ratio. This is sort of a transformation that's going to scale or change the size of our object while maintaining the proportions. And the nice thing is that this will calculate kind of how that animation needs to be done. And we just have to tell the starting size and the finishing. Next, we'll add the tile as a subview to the game board. This essentially will allow it to show up on the same view as the game board and kind of establish that connection. We'll then bring that subview to the front so that the user can see it. And we will add the index path. We'll add the tile to this collection of tiles, which will represent all the tiles objects that are currently on the game board. So now we want to actually add it visually to the board. So this will be done with this UI view animation. Again, we're using this affine transform, and we're moving the tile from the small scale to this max scale. So we're going to kind of pop it out, make it really big. And once that's completed, we're going to shrink it back down a little bit to its final size. And this will kind of create the pop effect. And with this, the tiles are now on the board. They're now visible to the user when they've been instantiated in the game model. Now that we have our game set up, we'll give a high overview on what happens next and how future squares are created. As the user plays the game, they will use swiping gestures to control how they want the blocks to move. The view controller is able to recognize these using the UI swipe gesture recognizer, which is able to recognize things like an up, down, left, or right swipe. These only will require one touch, and it'll look at the direction of the swipe to recognize what's happening. When a gesture is recognized, it'll trigger one of these command functions, which are going to recognize the direction of the move and queue up that move in the model. In the game model, moves are added to a queue to create a slight delay between each move. As we cycle through the queue, we will run this perform move function. In the perform move function, first, depending on what direction the move is made in, we'll generate a set of how each coordinate is going to need to change. We'll get a list of these coordinates, and then we'll get a list of tiles and map how those are going to need to transform. We'll then perform the actual operation in the merge function, which will check to see if a move is legal for each tile, and if so, if it needs to merge or where it's going to end up. All the while, we're checking to make sure that there's at least one legal move that can be made. We'll then write these results back and tell the view controller to make the similar move in the game board. The move is then sent to the game view, but let's focus on what happens here. After the completion of the move, we then have the follow-up function that runs. The follow-up function runs here in the view controller. First, it'll check to see if the user's won by reaching 2048. If they haven't, we'll generate a random value and use that value to generate a random tile at a random location. We'll then check to see if the user's lost. This process is then repeated add new tiles to the game board.